I want to start this off by saying that I'm not someone who gets freaked out easily. I grew up in a pretty rural area, so the dark, the woods, the sounds that come with being out in the middle of nowhere at night, none of that has ever bothered me much. I've always been the type of person who actually prefers being away from the city, away from the noise, away from people in general. So when something out in the middle of nowhere genuinely rattles me, I want you to understand that means something. Because what happened to me at that cabin a few years back is something I have not been able to fully shake. And I've tried. This was about 4 years ago. My girlfriend at the time, I'll call her Dana, had been pushing for us to take some kind of trip together for months. We had both been working a lot, and we were starting to feel that specific kind of tired that comes from not ever really stopping. Not physically tired, more like worn down at some deeper level. She kept saying we needed to get away somewhere with no distractions, no obligations, just the two of us. I agreed with her. I just kept putting off actually planning anything because that's the kind of person I am. I have good intentions and terrible follow-through when it comes to that stuff. She eventually just took over and planned the whole thing herself. Found a cabin about 2.5 hours from where we lived, out in a pretty remote stretch of forest. The listing made it look nice enough. A fireplace, a small porch, surrounded by trees on all sides, no neighbors visible from the property. She booked it for a long weekend, a Thursday through Sunday, and all I had to do was show up and drive. That I could manage. The drive out there was fine. We got there in the early evening, right around the time the sun was starting to go down. The cabin looked like the photos, which I always appreciate because sometimes those rental photos are doing a lot of heavy lifting. It was a decent size for 2 people, a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom in the back, and a bathroom that was a little outdated but functional. The porch looked out at the tree line, which was close. Like, closer than I expected from the photos. The trees started maybe 30 feet from the edge of the porch, and they were dense enough that once the light went, you couldn't see much past the first few rows of trunks. We settled in, got a fire going, made dinner. The first night was exactly what it was supposed to be. Quiet, easy, no pressure to do anything or be anywhere. We stayed up late talking the way you do when you finally have the time to actually sit and talk. I remember thinking on the way to bed that Dana had been right, and I should have let her plan this months ago. Everything felt good. The second day, we did a long hike on a trail that started about a mile down the road from the cabin. It was cold but not brutal, and the trail was well marked enough that we didn't have to think too hard about where we were going. We were out there for a few hours, and we didn't see another person the entire time, which was fine with us. That was kind of the point. We got back to the cabin in the early afternoon, a little tired, and spent the rest of the day doing not much of anything. Reading, napping, keeping the fire going. Normal weekend stuff. The second night is where I want to start paying closer attention in how I tell this, because the second night is when things started feeling different. It started small. Around 10 or 10:30, we were sitting on the couch near the fireplace and I heard something outside. A sound from the direction of the tree line. I didn't say anything about it right away because, like I said, I grew up around woods and I know that woods make sounds. Animals move around at night. Branches fall. Wind does weird things when it moves through dense trees, so I just noted it and kept my attention on the conversation we were having. But I heard it again about 20 minutes later, and this time it was a little different. Not a branch or an animal rustling. It was more rhythmic than that, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on dry leaves. I kept my face neutral, but I glanced toward the front window. From where we were sitting, I couldn't see much of anything outside because of the way the porch light was hitting the glass. Mostly just our own reflections staring back at us. I told Dana I was going to get some water, and I went to the kitchen, which had a window on the side of the cabin that faced a different angle than the front. I turned off the kitchen light before I looked out, which I realized probably looked strange in hindsight, but at the time I just didn't want to be visible if there was someone out there. I looked out the kitchen window, and I couldn't see anything moving. Just trees. Just dark. I went back to the couch and didn't say anything about it. I didn't want to alarm her over something that was probably nothing. That was the rational thought I kept coming back to. Probably nothing. This is what woods sound like at night. You've known this your whole life. Settle down. We went to bed around midnight. I'm usually a pretty solid sleeper, but that night I was lying there in the dark with my eyes open for a long time, just listening. The cabin had that particular quiet that places far from any road or town have, where you can actually hear your own breathing and every small sound registers. I was tracking every noise. The settling of the cabin, the wind outside, the occasional pop from the fireplace dying down in the other room. I was waiting for the footsteps sound again, and I didn't hear it. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I don't know what time, and I lay there for a second in that groggy in-between state, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard it, and I understood immediately. Someone was on the porch. Not a maybe, not a possibly. Someone was on the porch. The sound of weight on the wooden boards outside our bedroom window was not ambiguous. It was slow, and it was careful, like whoever it was trying not to make noise, but the old wood was giving them away anyway. One step, then a pause. Another step, then a pause. I did not move. I lay completely still, and I reached over slowly and put my hand on Dana's arm. She was a light sleeper and she woke up almost immediately. I put my finger to my lips before she could say anything. Her eyes adjusted to the dark and she looked at me, and I could tell from her face that she was about to ask what was wrong. I just pointed toward the window. She heard it too. I saw her whole body go rigid. The footsteps moved slowly across the porch toward the front of the cabin, toward the front door. Then they stopped, and it was quiet again. I lay there not breathing, staring at the ceiling, counting seconds. Nothing happened. No knock on the door. No sound of anyone trying the handle. Nothing. Just silence. After maybe 5 minutes of nothing, I got up slowly and went to the front room. The fireplace was just embers at that point, giving off a low red glow. I went to the front window and looked out at the porch. Empty. I looked out at the tree line, nothing moving that I could see. I stood there for a few minutes just watching, and then I went back to the bedroom and told Dana I didn't see anyone. She asked if I thought it had been an animal. I told her it could have been. I'm not sure I believed that when I said it, but it seemed like the reasonable thing to offer. We both lay back down, and neither of us slept much for the rest of that night. In the morning, everything looked completely normal. The porch looked undisturbed, which I had half expected to find some sign of something on. I'm not even sure what. We didn't talk about it much over breakfast. I think we were both doing that thing where you try to make something smaller than it felt in the dark by just not giving it a lot of attention in the daylight. We decided to stay one more night as planned. In retrospect, I've thought about that decision a lot. At the time, it felt like the sensible thing, because we genuinely weren't sure we had heard anything unusual. It was an old cabin in the woods, and old cabins in the woods make sounds. That's just true. The third night started normally. We made dinner. We watched something on Dana's laptop. We kept the fire going, but I was paying a different kind of attention than I had been the first 2 nights. I was aware of the tree line in a way I hadn't been before. I kept finding excuses to glance out the windows. I had checked the locks on the front door and the back door twice without telling Dana I was doing it. Around 11, Dana went to bed. I told her I was going to stay up a little longer and read. That was partly true. Mostly I just wanted to sit up and listen. I sat in the chair closest to the front window, with the lamp on the end table on and my book open in my lap, and I was not reading. I was listening. The fire was almost out. The cabin had gotten colder and I had pulled a blanket over my legs. Outside was completely still and quiet. Just after midnight, the motion sensor light on the porch kicked on. I did not move. I just looked up at the window. The porch light was bright enough to illuminate most of the porch from where I was sitting, but not the edges, not the corners. I stared at the window for a long moment, and I did not see anyone standing in the light. But the light had come on for a reason. Motion sensors don't just go off by themselves. I sat there watching the window for about 30 seconds, and then the light clicked back off. Another 30 seconds went by. Then it came back on again. Something was moving on or near that porch, either triggering the sensor and then stepping back out of its range, or moving at the edge of the sensor's coverage back and forth. I don't know which. What I know is that it went on and off 3 more times over the next 10 minutes. Always the same pattern. On for 30 seconds, off, back on. I got up and went to the bedroom and woke Dana up. I told her I needed her to be awake, and I told her what was happening. She sat up and she looked at me in the way that people look at you when they're scared but they don't want to be the one to say it first. I told her to stay in the bedroom with the door locked and I was going to call the number for the property manager that the rental listing had given us. She grabbed my arm and told me not to go to the front room. I told her I wasn't going outside. I was just going to make a call. I went back to the front room. The porch light was off again. I called the property manager's number and got voicemail. I left a message saying we were staying at the cabin this weekend and that we were hearing and seeing things outside at night that were making us uncomfortable and I needed someone to call me back. I kept my voice level because I was trying to stay level. Then I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. We sat there in the dark and quiet for a while. Dana had her phone out and I noticed she was looking up the address of the nearest town, which was about 15 miles away. She didn't say anything about it, but I understood what she was thinking. I made the decision about an hour later. It was almost 2 in the morning and nothing else had happened, but I was not going to spend what remained of that night lying awake in that cabin waiting to hear something on the porch again. I told Dana to pack what she needed for the night, just essentials, and we were going to drive into town and get a hotel room and come back for the rest of our stuff in the morning in daylight. She did not argue with me. We packed quickly and quietly. I turned off all the lights in the cabin before we went out so that when we opened the front door we wouldn't be backlit and visible to anyone who might be outside. I'm aware of how that sounds. At the time it felt like a reasonable precaution. I opened the front door and we went out to the car as fast as we could without running. I had the keys out before we hit the porch. We got in and I locked the doors and started the engine, and I pulled down the long gravel driveway without turning the headlights on until we hit the road. I don't know why exactly. It just felt right. We drove the 15 miles to the nearest town and got a room at the only motel there. It was not a nice motel. Neither of us cared. We lay in the dark in that motel room and I don't think either of us said very much. I think we were both just relieved to be somewhere with other people nearby, with parking lot lights outside the window, with the sound of an occasional car going by on the road. We went back to the cabin in the morning to get the rest of our things. It was fully daylight, and I had been telling myself all morning that everything would look different, that I would be able to find some obvious explanation for what had happened, and feel like an idiot for how rattled I had gotten. We pulled up to the cabin, and I got out of the car and walked up onto the porch. There were footprints. In the thin layer of frost that had settled on the porch boards overnight, you could see them clearly. They went from one end of the porch to the other, and then back. Not animal prints, boot prints. 2 feet, human stride, walking slowly back and forth across the front of our cabin in the night while we were inside. I stood there looking at those prints for a minute, and then I went inside and got our things as fast as I could and we left. We did not stop to clean up or make the bed or any of the other checkout things you're supposed to do. We just left. The property manager called me back 2 days later. I told him what we had found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the cabin had had some issues in the past with people using the surrounding forest, hikers or hunters passing through, who would sometimes come up to the cabin if they saw it was occupied, looking for water or directions or whatever. He said it like it was nothing. He offered us a partial refund. I took it and never went back. I've rented other cabins since then. Dana and I broke up about a year after this trip for reasons that had nothing to do with that weekend. I've gone to other remote places, stayed in other isolated spots, and been fine. But every time I'm somewhere without close neighbors and I hear something move outside in the dark, I think about that porch and those boot prints in the frost. And I think about whoever was out there, walking back and forth in front of our door at 2 in the morning, quiet enough that we almost didn't hear them. Almost. The second story I want to tell is one that took me a while to fully process. Not because it was complicated, but because of the specific way it unfolded. The way things revealed themselves slowly over the course of a couple of days. Each piece a little worse than the one before it. By the time I had the full picture, I remember thinking that if I had known at the beginning what I knew by the end, I would have handled the whole thing very differently. But that's always how it goes. This happened about 3 years ago. I had been going through a stretch of time that was genuinely difficult. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulation of a lot of smaller things wearing me down. Work had been stressful for months. I was living alone for the first time in a while, after a long relationship had ended, and I was still adjusting to what that felt like. I wasn't depressed exactly, but I was running low in a way that I couldn't seem to fix with the usual things. I needed to step away from everything for a few days and just reset. A coworker had mentioned to me a few months earlier that her family owned a small cabin up in the mountains that they occasionally rented out to people they knew, and that I should take her up on it sometime if I wanted a quiet place to decompress. I texted her out of the blue and asked if the cabin was available for a long weekend. She said it was, and she gave me a key and directions and told me to help myself to whatever was in the pantry and just to leave the place how I found it. I drove up there on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but in a good way. One main room that served as both living room and kitchen. One bedroom, one bathroom. Simple and clean. It sat at the end of a long dirt road that wound up through the trees, and from the front porch you could look out over a valley that dropped away below the property line. The view was genuinely something. I stood on that porch for a while when I first got there, just taking it in. The first day and a half were exactly what I needed. I hiked in the mornings, ate simple food, read for long stretches in the afternoon, went to bed early. I wasn't thinking about work or the breakup or any of the things that had been sitting heavy on me. I was just there, and that was enough. It was on the second afternoon that I first noticed something odd. I had come back from a hike and I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee when I realized I was looking at the dirt road that wound up to the cabin and thinking that the tire tracks in it looked different than they had that morning. When I had arrived the day before, my car's tracks were visible going up the road, the only fresh marks in the dirt. But now there appeared to be a second set of tracks laid over mine. Narrower tires, different tread pattern. Someone had driven up that road and presumably back down it while I was out hiking. I told myself it was probably my coworker or a family member checking on the place, or maybe someone who had taken the wrong turn on the dirt road and turned around. Both of those things were completely plausible. I went inside and didn't think much more about it. That night I was in the main room reading around 9 o'clock when I heard something from the direction of the small shed that sat about 50 feet to the side of the cabin. A metallic sound, brief, like something had shifted or been bumped. I looked up from my book and listened. Nothing else followed. The shed was where the property's outdoor equipment was stored. Firewood, some tools, that kind of thing. My coworker had mentioned it when she gave me the key, but said I probably wouldn't need anything from it. I thought about going out to check and decided against it. It had been a single sound and it had stopped immediately. I went back to my book, but I noticed that I had lost the comfortable feeling I'd had for the previous day and a half. I was reading the same paragraph over and over without it going in. I went to bed at a reasonable hour, and I lay in the dark thinking about the tire tracks and the sound from the shed and trying to talk myself out of the particular low-grade anxiety that had started settling in. I think part of what made it hard to dismiss was the combination. One thing on its own is easy to explain away. Two things start to feel like a pattern even if they're not related. The next morning I got up early and I went outside and walked over to the shed. The door was latched the same way it had been when I arrived, with a simple hook and eye closure that you could see hadn't been forced. I opened the door and looked inside. Everything looked the way it had when my coworker had briefly shown it to me when walking me through the property. Stacked firewood along the back wall, a few garden tools hanging on hooks, a push mower in the corner. Nothing obviously out of place. But there was something on the floor near the firewood that I was fairly certain hadn't been there when I'd looked in on the first day. A small pile of food wrappers. Granola bar wrappers and the plastic from a pack of crackers pushed loosely into the corner beside the woodpile, like someone had tried to tuck them out of sight but hadn't been particularly careful about it. I crouched down and looked at them without touching them. They were not old. The packaging was still crisp and clean the way it is when it's been recently discarded. Not weathered and dusty the way things get when they've been sitting in a shed for months. I stood back up and looked around the shed again, more carefully this time. In the corner behind the door, partially behind the push mower, there was a sleeping bag, rolled loosely, not like someone had packed it up to take somewhere, more like someone had just gotten out of it recently and shoved it aside. I left the shed and went back inside the cabin and locked the door behind me. Then I stood in the kitchen and thought through what I was looking at. Someone had been sleeping in that shed. Maybe the night before, maybe multiple nights. I had no way to know. The tire tracks on the road now had a different context. Someone had driven up, parked somewhere not visible from the cabin, and been using the shed as a place to stay. And last night, while I was sitting inside reading, that person had presumably been 50 feet away from me. I called my coworker and told her what I had found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she sounded genuinely alarmed, which was not reassuring because she knew the property well, and her being alarmed meant this wasn't something she had an easy explanation for. She said she had no idea who would be doing that, and that no one in her family had mentioned anyone being up there. She told me to leave if I felt uncomfortable, and that she was sorry and embarrassed. I had already made that decision before I called her. I packed my things up in about 15 minutes, which is the fastest I have ever packed anything in my life. Before I left, I went back to the shed and took a couple of photos of the sleeping bag and the wrappers on my phone, more out of instinct than any clear plan for what to do with them. Then I got in my car and drove down that dirt road and back to the highway, and I did not stop until I was well out of the mountains. I kept thinking on the drive home about the night before, sitting in that main room with the lamp on, completely relaxed, reading my book, and that person in the shed. What they were doing, how long they had been there, whether they had been out there on more than one night, whether they had walked past the cabin after dark and looked in at the light in the window. That last thought in particular was the one I kept coming back to and kept wishing I could stop coming back to. My coworker reported it to the local sheriff's department. They went out and took a look and found the shed the way I had left it, but no sign of the person. They told her it was likely someone just looking for somewhere to shelter, not uncommon in that area. That may well have been true. I'm willing to believe that whoever it was had no bad intentions and was just someone in a difficult situation looking for a place to sleep. But I don't know that. And the tire tracks on the road, and the way that metallic sound had cut off so suddenly the night before, like someone who had made a noise they hadn't meant to make and then went completely still, those things don't let me fully land on the harmless explanation and stay there. Some things you can rationalize, and some things just sit in you regardless of what the rational explanation probably is. The third story is the one I debated telling for a long time because of how it ends, or more accurately because of how it doesn't end. There's no resolution to it, no explanation that arrived later, no information that came out that made it all make sense. It just happened, and it stopped, and I've been left with it ever since. I'm telling it anyway, because I think those are sometimes the most honest stories to tell, the ones where you don't get an answer. This was about 2 years ago. I have a habit of taking solo trips when I can manage them. I find them genuinely restorative in a way that trips with other people often aren't. When you're alone, you move at your own pace. You don't have to manage anyone else's experience. And there's a particular quality of attention you can give to your surroundings when you're not also tracking another person. I realize that makes me sound antisocial. I am somewhat antisocial. I've made peace with that. I had found a cabin through one of the rental platforms, a small place about 3 hours from home, up in a heavily wooded area near a state park. The listing had good photos and decent reviews, and the price was reasonable. I booked it for 5 nights, which was a longer trip than I usually took, but I had some time off work and I wanted to actually use it. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The cabin was at the end of a narrow paved road that dead-ended at the property. No neighbors within visible distance, which the listing had mentioned and which I had taken as a selling point. The cabin itself was older but well maintained. Solid front door with a good deadbolt, windows that closed properly, a wood stove in the main room that worked well. I settled in that afternoon and felt good about the choice. The first 2 days were uneventful and good. I hiked both mornings, spent the afternoons at the cabin, cooked simple meals, read in the evenings. The area was genuinely beautiful. The kind of forest where the trees are big enough that they block out a lot of the sky, and everything underneath them has a particular quality of light and shadow that changes through the day. I was sleeping well and waking up rested, and the general weight I had been carrying around from daily life was lifting the way it does when you actually disconnect. On the third day, a Tuesday, I came back from my morning hike and found something at the cabin that stopped me on the porch before I went inside. There was a single wildflower sitting on the porch railing. Just one, laid flat, not in any container, just placed there. A small yellow flower, the kind that grows at the edges of fields and roadsides. I stood there looking at it for a moment. I told myself it could have blown there. It was a small, lightweight flower, and the morning had been breezy, but it was sitting flat on the railing in a way that looked placed rather than blown there. And it was the only thing on the railing, and the railing was not a place where something blown by the wind would naturally land and stay neatly. I left it where it was and went inside. I did not mention it to anyone. There was no one to mention it to. I thought about it periodically through the rest of the day, but I kept coming back to the wind explanation and trying to stay there. By evening, I had mostly set it aside. The next morning, Wednesday, I woke up and went to the kitchen to make coffee, and there was a flower on the kitchen windowsill inside the cabin. The window had been closed. I was certain the window had been closed because I had checked all the windows the night before going to bed, which was something I had started doing on the first night without fully acknowledging to myself why I had started doing it. I stood in the kitchen looking at that flower on the windowsill for a long time. It was the same kind of flower as the one on the porch railing. Small, yellow, the same type. Someone had been inside the cabin while I was sleeping and left it there. I went through the whole cabin slowly, checking everything. Nothing else was out of place. Nothing had been taken or moved. The front door was still locked. I checked the back door, locked. I checked every window, all closed, all latched from the inside. I could not find a point of entry that made obvious sense, which somehow made it worse rather than better. I packed a bag with what I needed for a few days, and I sat down and thought about my options. I could leave immediately. I could call the property owner. I could call local law enforcement. I went through those options and what each of them would look like. Leaving felt like the right call, but I sat with it for a while because I am not someone who rushes to conclusions, and I was trying to be honest with myself about how certain I actually was about what I was looking at. I was certain. Someone had come into that cabin and left a flower on the windowsill while I was asleep in the next room, and then left without me knowing. That was what had happened. I had no other explanation that accounted for all the facts. I called the property owner. She answered after a few rings, and I explained what I had found calmly and completely. The porch railing flower, the kitchen windowsill flower, the locked windows and doors. She was quiet for longer than I expected after I finished. Then she said that nothing like this had ever happened with her property before, and she was very sorry, and that I should absolutely feel free to leave, and she would give me a full refund for the remaining nights. I asked her if there was anyone who had access to the cabin, a cleaner, a maintenance person, a family member. She said a maintenance person had a key, but that she had never had any reason to believe he would come onto the property unannounced, and certainly not to leave flowers inside while a guest was sleeping. She said she would contact him. I left that afternoon. I drove the 3 hours home, and I got there in the evening, and I sat in my own apartment for a while before I could actually settle. The property owner called me back the next day and told me she had reached the maintenance person, and he had confirmed he had not been to the property that week at all. She said she didn't know what to tell me. I said I didn't either. She gave me the full refund. I've turned that situation over in my head more times than I can count. Not just who did it or how they got in, though those things too. Mostly why. Of all the things someone could do, of all the ways that situation could have gone, they left a flower. Something small and non-threatening and almost gentle. And that choice, that specific strange choice, is the part I genuinely cannot get my head around no matter how many times I try. Because it doesn't fit any framework I have for understanding what that person wanted or what they were trying to communicate. I still take solo trips. I'm not someone who is willing to let one experience take that away from me permanently. But I sleep lighter than I used to in unfamiliar places. I check things more carefully than I used to. And sometimes when I'm in a cabin alone and the night is quiet enough that I can hear everything, I lie awake. And I think about how much you cannot actually know about what's on the other side of a wall when the lights are out, and you're far enough from anywhere that nobody would hear you if you needed them to. That thought has a way of keeping you very still and very awake.